Everyone, welcome back. I know we're still waiting on some people, but it would probably be best to get started since we have 4 presenters for our next panel, Rethinking Missions and Desired Outcomes. And we'll go again in the order of our program, beginning with Pamela, then Katherine, Carolyn, and Deondra. So Pamela, if you'd like to take it away.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And just a little asterisk at the beginning here. I recrafted my remarks this morning as others were talking because, I think that hopefully makes this whole session a little more deliberative, right? And that we're responding to each other. So hopefully they still make sense and are kind of organized. But I also, I hope that they're sort of grounded in the idea of sort of questions, because I have questions, right, that my work has led to, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists and the rest of you have to say about some of these questions. So, but I want to talk through today just some experience that I've had as a relatively new center. So we're in our 4th year here, and I'm at a small liberal arts college. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the learning and adaptation that I've had over the last few years. And hopefully that's helpful as others have been thinking about how their centers are growing or changing. So, most centers for public discourse articulate their mission, in their mission, a commitment to enhancing student learning and a contribution to the community, right? Advancing democracy, improving public communication. And while we know that these outcomes are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, they're codependent, right? But community engagement through deliberation has demonstrated outcomes for elevating students' critical thinking, problem solving, and civic identity, just to name a few. And we can also show with evidence the ways that community deliberation improves public participation and community decision-making. Realizing these outcomes are not straightforward. And frankly, leading a center that does this work is demanding, right? So I'm a fairly new center. It is me, right? I'm a director. I don't have a staff or a team. And I suspect that's not an uncommon structure for many places. So my learning and how to advance this sort of student community mission as I'm building a center, it was grounded initially in a mission that views deliberation as praxis, right? So that we are trying to think through, how do we help communities engage in public conversations meaningfully? How can they come together to address, right, the wicked problems that Martine talked about together and navigate their disparate values in that process? This is a research question for me, and it's grounded in, a commitment to democracy and social justice. Yet this community-based work has now become a secondary goal of my academic center for 2 reasons, right? So while that's sort of where my sort of theoretical and research energies, right, are animated, in terms of a center, I've had to kind of rethink a little bit in terms of what is sort of primary as a goal and outcome, and what is secondary. So I want to talk about sort of 2 reasons. One is strategic, right? So while community outcomes and student learning are expressed as values for an institution like mine, they are not equally valued by academic institutions. So while community and tackling the great challenges of our time are discursive institutional commitments at my college, they are not outcomes that my institution measures in allocating resources. So they fall into a broad category of marketing and public relations as anecdotal evidence for the college's broader mission. As such, the community engagement of a public discourse center is not necessarily more valued or more important than any other story about students, faculty, or staff doing something in the community. So strategically for my center, my institution won't sustain its support if the primary focus is community engaged deliberation and work and practice, right? So one is sort of thinking strategically about how to advance my mission in a way that helps the institution sustain it. The second reason, right, that I've had to think a little bit differently about how to advance mission is educational, right? So community work alone. So I have, I do this through classes and I do this through research, right, is thinking about how do we improve and how do we develop community conversations that advance our community's ability to talk with each other, to work through challenges, to work through problems. those community conversations alone don't, though, sufficiently equip my students as facilitators or students more broadly at the college to practice talking through and about their different perspectives. It doesn't necessarily give my student facilitators enough practice, right? So in order to become stronger facilitators, I need more opportunities for them to be at the table with others and learning how to do and moderate those spaces in ways that are meaningful. It also, we need more opportunities, particularly at my campus, for students to be actively participating in those conversations. I'm thinking a little bit about the stuck points that Rhonda was talking about earlier, right? That most people are not equipped to work through those right away, or even right after a while. When my students talk about, facilitating deliberations, particularly with people that they are participating in a conversation like this for the first time, it's about 2/3 of the way through the conversation before they even start to feel like they're engaging with each other, because they aren't practiced at it, right? Because they are not coming sort of already fully equipped to even understand what this might look like or what it takes. And so I've started, right, to think more about deliberation as practice, right? So building on this learning and in conversation with administration at my institution, I've elevated the goal of embedding deliberative practice in the curriculum as primary, right, for advancing my center's mission. My students go, my student facilitators, right, go into courses every semester and they facilitate deliberation around a variety of topics, largely drawing upon and using the National Issues Forum deliberations. There are some that we design ourselves, but those are kind of, that's the model that we have used, and with great success, right? So there are very clear learning outcomes, even from the first conversation that first deliberation students participate in. But there's also the very clear, right, beyond the learning outcomes, there's a very clear articulation from students that they are hungry for this practice, right? They are so excited to be able to talk about critical issues, not necessarily talking about themselves, talking about critical issues in a meaningful way and being able to hear what others think about those same issues, right? And that has invited them to want to be part of conversations around things that they didn't think they could talk about before. And they express that, right, in surveys and reflections on these deliberations. So there is both a hunger for that practice, right, being able to practice talking to each other. And there is also, right, the clear learning outcomes. We have quite a bit of survey evidence of this. And I've done some of that work also with Sarah Drury. And now also with Katie Knobloch. So that's in a broader conversation, but those sort of student learning outcomes are embedded in practicing talking to each other about critical issues. And I just want to emphasize that that has become, though it's not where my own research has been, it is where I realize my center needs to be and where some of my research has been grounded now. And I also want to say that there's also then, of course, the strategic outcome, which is for my center in terms of sustaining resources, time, financial support. And every semester, I can highlight the number of students on campus, across campus, that are engaged in this practice. And there are the right, so there's the quantitative evidence, and then there's also the qualitative reflections on their learning after a deliberation. And that is actually, right, what is going to sustain and has sustained and continue to garner support from my institution. It also enables other things, right, that allow me to do and continue to do community engaged work. But I have had to think about how to elevate that, both for educational reasons, right, elevating deliberation as practice, and for strategic reasons. So I want to wrap up just by asking sort of two questions. The first is perhaps more cynical, but the second, I think, hopefully will lead to some other conversation, is one, how do we advance a mission grounded in student learning and community that justifies institutional resources, time, space, money? And the less cynical question perhaps is, what are ways that your respective centers increase opportunities for students to engage in deliberation with each other to build their capacity to talk about with and across their different perspectives? And I'll leave it there so I can hear from the rest of you. Yeah.
Thanks, Pamela. And I can completely identify with that experience of relocating your center. That was well put. Katherine, or excuse me, sorry, Katie.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with you. It helps me organize my thoughts. Hi, everyone. Again, sorry that I had to jump on late. I had to drop off the kids at school. I'm with the Center for Public Deliberation, and we've been around since 2006. Martine founded us. I joined in 2013. So I'm going to talk about the ways that our center has really evolved over the last few years. So our mission statement is somewhere around what I've posted today: an impartial resource dedicated to enhancing local democracy through improved public communication and community problem solving. We've gone back and forth about the mission statement. It's been tweaked slightly. We use slightly different versions of it sometimes. It's something that we've had internal conversations about pretty thoroughly. And it's been difficult for us to kind of pin down everything that we do as a center. And in part, that's because we've undergone a lot of change. So some of our original key functions that we still stick to today are to obviously host impartial public conversations across difference. So we work with a lot of different community partners to help them have better conversations in our community. Part of that has always been training students in facilitation. So our students get trained in the classroom, take parts in lots of facilitation exercises, and then go out in the community and host those conversations with our partners. And then ideally to enhance local democracy, right? Create better networks, create better civic skills throughout our community so that we can do the work of democracy better. So we still do these things, but we've added kind of a bunch of new missions, or there have been ways that our work has changed over the past several years. One is really an increased focus on inclusion and equity. So really thinking about who can come to our meetings, how do they show up, how can we create better equity within the conversation. We've also expanded our focus on civic skills, both for students and the community. And we've started kind of the boring and tedious work of systematizing both our funding and our functions. So I'm going to talk through all of those things. And I'm going to use a program called Community Guides to explain them. We've been doing community guides since 2017, and so I'll talk through what that shift has looked like with this program. We've used it for mainly in partnership with the city of Fort Collins. We've used it for strategic planning, for housing and health, and for climate sustainability. So one is simply intentional project selection, and we've heard about this already, right? Thinking about equity and inclusion, when do we say no? And we've been much more intentional lately about, is this the right time for deliberation? If not, this is not the right project for us, right? So one of the big things was our schools were considering what to do about school resource officers. There were lots of student protests. They wanted us to come in and host some deliberations. And we said, no, we're not going to come in and slow things down when the students are obviously already doing the work of being heard. So we don't want to kind of step in on activism and slow it down. Another thing that we've done is to develop, really focus on interest group conversations prior to deliberation. And that's what community guides do. We train folks in the community to host conversations with others in their community, friends, neighbors, coworkers, acquaintances. So you can have folks, say, in a mobile home community, having a conversation about public issues before we ask them to have that conversation across difference. And this is based in kind of recent deliberative theory that says particularly historically excluded groups need those spaces to understand and articulate their own interests before they're expected to advocate for those interests across power difference. We also engage in pretty intensive targeted stakeholder engagement and recruitment. So we've always kind of thought about who should be at our meetings and use targeted and network recruitment to bring people in. But we've systematized that in our work with our partners. We have an ongoing spreadsheet that kind of lists all of our community groups, how we're connected to them. And we work pretty closely with our partners for every project that we're thinking through, thinking about who needs to be in this room, how do we best connect with them? And then really, really focusing on the barriers to inclusion. So in some cases, that means paying people to participate. Almost always that means offering events at places that people can get to, not on our campus because it's a maze and intimidating for folks outside of the community, making sure that we're having them in different places around town that has public transportation, that we're offering food and childcare whenever we can go back to face again. But then also for things like the community guides, we actually started that focusing on historically excluded groups and then ran a few phases before we reached out to the wider community. Again, based on that premise that those groups deserve to kind of have some extra space for conversations because they hadn't been granted that space in the past. So those are some of the ways that we have attended to inclusion and equity in our mission. Part of that is also expanding our sense of what civic skills are necessary. So while we used to focus primarily on facilitation, both in our community training and in our student programs, we've really expanded those skills. So now we're offering trainings on stakeholder engagement. I do work with a lot of the local schools that's focused on community organizing and public work. So really saying, how do we create skills that are going to make sense across the democratic spectrum and not just in the deliberative space? And then we also do that through our student teams. So in our program, the first semester is spent learning how to facilitate. And then the second semester is spent learning how to do the work of community engagement. So we have 5 teams currently that our students can participate in: process design, public relations, research teaching, and public achievement. All of these allow our students to specialize their skills beyond facilitation, and we integrate them in our work. So students might help us come up with questions for a community guide conversation or help us design a process for a community forum. They might help recruit participants into it, developing marketing materials. Our research and data team analyzes all of the table conversations and turn those into reports that they can give to the city. So for community guides, at the end of it, we had surveys that participants could take. Our students then thematically coded all of those surveys and helped me turn that into a report that we gave to the city. And eventually a lot of those quotes ended up in our city's strategic housing plan. Our teaching team helps us think through, how do we teach folks to do this better? And I've already mentioned our public achievement team, which goes out into schools and teaches community organizing and public work. And then finally, one of the biggest kind of day-to-day shifts that we've made is in our professionalization. So in the past few years, we hired a managing director, which was really crucial to our program's ability to function. Martine and I obviously have lots of other commitments besides the CPD, although the CPT tends to kind of take over all of our work. But our managing director can really spend all of her time thinking through our work, building community connections, doing the logistics, kind of doing the day-to-day stuff that we need to make the center run. And that, I think, has given Martine and I the space to kind of apply the theory, think more holistically about the work that we're doing, because we're not doing things like ordering food anymore. We also moved to a business plan. So this means that we are a fee-for-service program now. So basically, to work with us, you either need to pay us or help us get some grant funding. This means that we have to write scopes of work and contracts with all of our partners. We have different kind of levels of service payment, whether you're at the university, a nonprofit, or in the wider community. And recently we actually started bidding on projects. So we just did a bid for a minimum wage project with our city. So that requires a lot of kind of logistical day-to-day, tracking your hours, all of that type of things. However, I think there's some really big benefits of that. I think we're actually getting approached for bigger projects because of it. It's also allowed us to kind of understand our funding and have a streamline of funding instead of, trying to cobble together stuff and not being sure if we're using this funding in the right place. Now it's all kind of streamlined and we know exactly what we're responsible for and who we're responsible to. And it's also enabled us to shift towards more repeat processes and ongoing projects. So community guides, we've been doing since 2017. We have a lot of ongoing, so that's kind of an example of a repeat process design that we're implementing more than once across issues. but we're also doing a lot more ongoing projects. So housing and health was 2 years. You know, a lot of our projects are taking place over the course of multiple years. Martine just started a deliberative journalism project that's taking place over the course of multiple years. And this really allows us to kind of dig in and do the long-term work rather than offering kind of one-off conversations. Happy to talk more about any of this after. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Katie. Next up, Carolyn.
Yes, thank you again for inviting me, and it's such a pleasure to hear what people are doing. I want to talk just in 3 general areas in my 10 minutes. The first is to introduce you to my initiative for public deliberation and why I formed it. Second, I'd like to address the prompts about how we can best serve the needs of the students in the community. And then I'll end by discussing about how I'm rethinking some missions and goals of my institute based on the current political climate. In 2012 and 13, our local community really sort of fell apart and had increasingly uncivil, if not hostile, discussions about a particular infrastructure project in our community. We have a fairly liberal city council that was coming against a very conservative county council over this bridge project, and it really fell apart. And one of the reasons why it fell apart was the inability of the organizers of this project to find a way to systematically collect information from the public about the issue, and also some mistakes that were made about outreach. And at the same time this was happening, I was doing some research on political polarization, which has been mentioned before. Pew has done some great work on this, and seeing how we were headed down a path where it was going to become increasingly more difficult to talk about difficult policy issues, even ones as mundane as creating a bridge. So I created the Initiative for Public Deliberation, basically based on the fine model that Martine and Katie have done with the Center for Public Deliberation, because I was alarmed at the dysfunction that I was seeing, and I wanted to do something about it. But also, very importantly, I wanted our university to become that steward of place, the phrase we often use, so that people would come to us as a resource for helping the community in its problem solving, helping give people an opportunity to talk about important issues. And so after examining various models, I chose our model to be similar to CPD. So I train my students with a semester-long class where I combine both theory and practice. So I'm a political scientist, so we talk about political polarization and why it's occurring, but I also speak about deliberative democracy techniques and the theories behind them. And then the second part of the course, we focus on how students can learn to be facilitators. The students themselves select a topic, they host a series of forums on that topic, and then we have them practice. And so we officially became an institute in 2015, had no funding, which I think is common to many of our experiences. But I was able to do so by teaching my class in load, and then by really relying on student support to both make the class successful, then make the forum successful as well. So our goal is to strengthen democratic government by replacing rigid partisanship with listening and conversation. And our mission is to serve as that impartial resource for Southwest Washington to assist in their community problem solving. And then in regards to learning objectives, my students, as yours, will learn critical 21st century skills and experiences that are applicable in many contexts, such as obviously facilitating, collaborative problem solving, issue analysis, and then of course, how to research and create a forum and get the right people at the table. So students are the center of our work, and they take the lead. They do so in classroom discussions. They are, again, the ones that create the forums. Returning students act as trainers. We had Martine come out a couple of times to train our students, and then we took over the training on our own so that they would have that experience. Graduates of our program who are still in the community will often come to us as facilitators for future events. And then in addition to that, we want to pay it forward since we borrowed so much from Martine. So we have hosted facilitation trainings for high school students, for staff at our regional libraries, And we've partnered with a number of external groups so that we can host the forums productively. And then several years ago, I was quite proud that we did a 2-day training conference for 120 participants from local colleges and community members. So I was asked, there were 2 prompts in this conversation that I want to address. One was how our programs can best serve the needs of students, and the second was how to best serve the community. For the needs of the students, I think the best way that we can serve them, of course, is to have faculty dedicated to this work, not as an add-on, but as part of their teaching responsibilities, so that we look forward to this and that we're not just doing it as additional service work, because I think the work is too important for that. I also think it's important that we provide adequate time to teach our students about these theories and about those practical skills, and then the practice, as Katie just mentioned. Third, I think we have to learn to flip our classrooms when we're teaching this as much as possible. So it emphasizes student work and student leadership as opposed to the faculty. Fourth, I think it's important that the students learn and refine the skills that they can use, and they can use them in a variety of contexts. So for instance, when they learn facilitation, they have to learn to actively listen, their interpersonal communication skills, a dedication to an impartial process, and students need to have time where they can be skilled at doing this so that they then feel comfortable going out in the community and doing it more. And the other thing that we talk about is how all these skills are transferable. They're transferable to real world conflicts in your place of employment. They're transferable to dealing with a botherly neighbor. They're transferable to that Thanksgiving dinner with the aunt who's drinking too much and has gotten hostile in their conversations. And then finally, I think that students need to learn why this matters. And that's why I incorporate in my class the discussion about polarization, not just with elected officials, but with people as well, because we are becoming increasingly polarized. The second prompt was about how the program could best serve the community. Again, you have to have a viable program to serve the community's needs. So it's making sure that you can have that level of viability, which for us, like with CPD, is partnering with external groups. They are groups that may be predisposed to a particular issue that we're holding a forum on, or predisposed to our mission, like the YWCA or regional libraries. I think that, those partnerships help us have that infrastructure to be successful. Second, to best serve the community, we have to be able to get the funding that is necessary. I don't know if it's a fee for service model, but for us, we were able to get some minor grants to host our forums. Program serves the community if you focus on forum topics that are relevant to the community. And I love the earlier comments about how timing is important. You can't be too early and you can't be too late. And so a lot of time in our class is spent on what it is we should tackle. We've tackled affordable housing, education, race, opioids, because all of them were pressing issues at the time. Also, to best serve the community is something that Katie mentioned, which is to make sure that a diversity of opinions are represented, and particularly reaching out to those that are underrepresented. And then finally, we want to be able to make sure that people have a good deliberative experience, which is when you host a good forum. I mean, if you're organized, you do good outreach, you end up ultimately having a good experience. But I want to end by talking about how I'm rethinking what our mission is. I mean, a lot of people who do this work have surveys of people who've had deliberative experiences, and people will talk about how wonderful the experience was, and they would repeat it, they do it again, and they give us reasons why it's great. But I've been thinking increasingly about how the work that we're doing might help shape public policy more specifically. We're all aware of the 3-minute problem, where people will shout in a microphone at elected leaders about how they feel about an issue, and how they themselves won't listen to what people are saying. We also know that extreme views are being highlighted often in these opportunities to provide feedback. And certainly the media today, in talking about politics, really speaks about extreme views. And then we also know that politicians pay attention to the loudest voice in the room, and they actually keep track of who contacts them. So I would suggest that they have a distorted perspective of public opinion on particular issues. So what I'm working on right now is to find out how we can best use our work to have a positive influence on public policy by capturing the public sentiment. So I just didn't do PowerPoint, but I just briefly want to share my screen to talk a little bit about, oh, I don't think it's doing it. Oh no. Oh, here it is. Like CPD, we take notes for each of our tables, and then we write reports after each of our facilitation forums. And this is an example of notes. It's really, we talk about themes. This person wrote really good notes and tried to pick out a lot of specific things that were said. And that's important, having those notes, which we of course give to the participants. The other thing that we do is we write reports. And this is an example of an executive summary from our summit on access to higher education. And it was a long report, it's about 25 pages, but it is trying to give people some sense of what individuals thought about the issues in a way that is not statistically significant, but to give numbers attached to it. And so I'm hoping that this, and I'll give you one more example, or this report, which talks about how many people participated, how many people were at the table, and then how they came to conclusions on certain issues might be useful to policymakers. So this is something that I'm toying with. I don't know if it's gonna help, but I do know anecdotally that after we held a series of forums on affordable housing, mailed the reports to the elected leaders, had it widely publicized in the press, that afterwards, 6 months later, we had the city pass a levy to provide millions of dollars for affordable housing. It wasn't because of us, but I think that we did play a role in at least telling people how the public felt about this particular issue. So that's what I'm exploring now. I don't know if there's the best way to do it. I look forward to suggestions you might have, but I think this is a direction that me as a political scientist want to see us moving towards, in addition to people having a good civic experience. Sorry, I went over time, but I'll end there.
Thanks, Carolyn. Great job. And finally, Deondra.
Thank you so much. So I will also share my screen, if I may. Well, I'm also going to time myself because I've become increasingly long-winded in the last couple of years. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation, and particularly to be on this panel with Pamela, Katie, and Carolyn, because a lot of their remarks reflect, the gold standard that we're moving toward, I think, here at Polis, and also a lot of my thinking on the significance of dialogue for a democracy as a political scientist. So to just echo a lot of what Carolyn just said in her remarks, just to give you a little bit of a frame, I'm a student of higher education policy. That's my area of expertise. And so I hope it's okay that I'm going to talk a little bit about how dialogue factors into my thinking about my role as a researcher, as an educator, and as a center director here. So I guess I'll take you back a little bit to this course that I teach. I teach in the core curriculum here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. And there's this class called Pub Pol 301, Political Analysis of Public Policy. Students from generations have been tried with this course. And so one of the things that I think is especially important as we think through teaching our undergrads is whether we're giving them the skills necessary to be not only workers. I think students come to college and oftentimes they're thinking about their employment possibilities afterwards, but I think of my responsibility is really working to help them develop as fully engaged democratic citizens for the long term. And so about 5 years ago, our politics center started in 2015, and around that time, there was a lot of discussion about civil discourse. And so I was thinking, well, I really need to embed this in my core class. And I felt really proud of myself. In fact, we had a small unit. We started thinking through some best practices for listening first. And I noticed, though, that the students they were very polite, but they started rolling their eyes. And eventually, I actually got a chance to chat with someone. And I said, well, what's the deal? Are you all not buying this? And they're like, sorry, professor, this civil discourse stuff is just kind of played out. We actually don't believe that this is the kind of discourse, we don't buy this. We feel like sometimes you have to break stuff to get things done. And so I started to really, it gave me pause, and it made me work a little harder to unpack this idea of discourse and what I was seeking to do. So I went back to the drawing board. Thinking through the mission of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Terry Sanford is our namesake, former governor of North Carolina, former US Senator representing the state, also a former presidential candidate, former Duke president. So this is someone who straddled both the academy and public service as an engaged thinker. And one of the mottos for our school is using knowledge in the service of society. So I think a lot, again, about providing students with tools necessary to engage in democracy over the long term. So I went back to the drawing board, and I actually got a chance to chat with a number of different people. I tried to deliberate pretty broadly in thinking through many aspects of my course. And one of the things that I found most useful was talking to alumni, particularly those who are policy practitioners, and asking them, like, hey, if you're looking to bring people into your teams, what are you looking for? And they said, okay, we're looking for people who can think outside of the box, people who are not afraid to ask questions, that you could give them an assignment, but they don't need to have everything micromanaged to have all the details. They're not afraid and not uncomfortable when it comes to working with people who are different from them, people who have different perspectives, who maybe don't share their opinions. And I'm thinking through my class, and I'm like, nope, I don't think I'm doing many of those things at all. So I really did overhaul the course. And one key part of that overhaul was to include a more robust treatment of discourse and dialogue, where we really work to unpack, what does it mean to have civil discourse? What are some alternatives to civil discourse? Like sometimes there's confrontational rhetoric that we might consider, or engaging in protest. And are any of those inherently better than the others? And what will serve our purposes, say here on campus when we're deliberating over issues. So really inviting students to be a part of that conversation, I think, has lent itself to increasing authenticity in our engagement. And that has helped, I think, to bring a lot of students into those conversations, or at least to not have them reject what we're doing outright. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking through in my research, and of course, as I approach the work of the Politics Center, is thinking through higher education for the 21st century. In many ways, I think that we are still, as organizations, as institutions, embracing frameworks that, sure, they worked for us in the mid-20th century, but I think there are some interesting challenges facing higher education today, and public policy schools in particular today, that maybe weren't the case a generation ago or 2 generations ago. And I think that means that we have to be nimble in rethinking our missions and our purposes. And so I don't know if many of you have engaged with President Ron Daniels' book, Johns Hopkins University's president. He has this fantastic new book on the responsibility that higher education has toward democracy. And so really thinking about the kinds of programming that we're offering in terms of our curriculum and our co-curricular and extracurricular programming very intentionally, I think, is important for thinking through what the next century, or this current century, of higher education ought to look like. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how I can take the opportunities that I have to engage with students and to make them more fruitful and, I think, more beneficial to these students in the long term. One thing that is a challenge, and many of you have touched on this, is the fact that our student bodies, the targets of our engagements, are increasingly, what they're bringing to this table is increasingly diverse. And in terms of politics on a campus like Duke, it can be really difficult to achieve the kinds of balance or the numbers necessary to have meaningful conversations, particularly around partisan issues or issues where there are clear partisan divides on campus. I don't know if many of you are plugged into the things going on with Duke students, but we actually do not any longer have a chapter of the Duke Young Republicans. They've disbanded. There's an organization called the Ciceronian Society, who I think are a bit further right than the Young Republicans have traditionally been. There's a Duke Democrats chapter, and their engagement has ebbed and flowed over the years. So even increasingly, students are hesitant to identify with the party. I've done surveys in my classes and asked students if they'd be comfortable sharing. In many cases, students actually do not share their authentic party identification. They'll fabricate it, and they'll say because they don't want any backlash from a faculty member or their classmates. So I think really finding ways to invite students to engage authentically related to political party questions and issues is a big challenge in this space. And I think connected to this issue is something that Ryan pointed out earlier in his important and thought-provoking presentation, is how do we do this without, I think, failing to acknowledge that there are some perspectives coming from political parties in today's contemporary landscape that really are anti-democratic and problematic, and I would argue antithetical to a lot of what we're trying to do in our educational missions. So how to not actually treat those as though they're equivalent, I think, is something that we have a responsibility to take seriously as well. So this is just a really simple depiction of a survey that the students did recently of the Duke class of 2025, the incoming freshmen, just a look at their ideological self-reported ideological identification. So as you see again, there's a relative dearth of students who identify as conservative. Students are much more likely to say that they're liberal, very liberal, and somewhat more moderate. We also know that our student population is particularly diverse, increasingly diverse. So we've got students from 48 states, 85 foreign countries. 55% of the students identify as women, and 56% identify as students of color. One of the things that we've tried to do here at Polis is to also make sure that we're not situating sort of a student who has US citizenship as the mean student, recognizing that it's important to engage in discourse work, dialogue work, political consideration related work with an acknowledgement that we're also global citizens. So thinking through what that means, I think historically we've tended to focus on the US national perspective, and we're trying to do a better job of being more balanced. So one of the things that just kind of in this progression, and I'll breeze through this a little more quickly, in my own thinking about this movement from civil discourse to a more complicated thinking of discourse, is to work through some really interesting resources. So a number of people have mentioned, I think it might have been Leslie earlier who mentioned Listen First. So we've worked with some of their tools, thinking through some really interesting alternatives. I have a few resources. If anyone sees anything here and would be interested in some of the resources, if you're not familiar with them, I'd be excited to share. But also thinking through this idea of moving from safe spaces to brave spaces, to underscore Braver Angels as a really valuable partner that we're seeking to work with. Also wanted to give a quick shout to some of the things that our center has been doing. So our theme this year is Discourse for Democracy, and we've been trying to take a step back and do some reflecting on what discourse means and why it's significant to democracy, involving students, faculty, and staff in that process. So this is just a screenshot of something that appears on our website, polis.duke.edu. You see the dean of our school, Kelly, weighing in, a graduate student, my colleague, John Rose, over in ethics. And I'll actually show you as I move a bit more quickly because I know I'm beyond my time. Some quick quotes from these people. So Professor Rose, who's doing some fantastic work, and I know he regrets that he couldn't be here with us today, I think is one of, on campus, the people who's really doing the most path-breaking and pioneering work in this space in the classroom, and the students are really responding to it. The students are also engaging with our questions and have been very insightful in helping us think through the significance of discourse and what it means for our particular community and those who are thinking about policies. So all that to say, we've been really seeking to bring students in who maybe haven't been as actively engaged with our programs at the undergrad and graduate levels. We've been trying to offer opportunities to model quality, transformative, meaningful discourse. So bringing together people like Art Pope and Tom Ross here in North Carolina, who come from very different political perspectives and ideological perspectives, to model how to have meaningful conversations, where to find common ground, highlighting local political leaders who've been very, very forthcoming and sharing some of the challenges they face, particularly when coming from traditionally excluded backgrounds. So those are the kinds of programs that we've been centering, the kind of work we've been doing. And I will stop there and be excited to answer any questions at the end of the session.
Awesome. Thank you, Deondra, along with Pamela, Katie, and Carolyn. Another great panel. We got about 7 minutes left before we depart for a much needed lunch. So happy to, I think we can engage questions for both panels if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make.
I'll direct this to Martine and Katie and Carolyn. I'm intrigued in terms of how you go about building partnerships with community partners, both how you know, kind of how do you think about, you know, who do you aim? Are you, you know, you've made clear that you've been making an effort to be thoughtful about bringing people in, but I imagine the same question would be true of the community partners that you bring with, because otherwise very traditional parties would step forward and you know, voices that aren't necessarily, so just hearing some of the kind of the intentionality by which you approach that work.
We're also respectful. Nobody knows when to speak first. Martine, you go first. I'll follow you because I stole most of your ideas.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly we have to be thoughtful about that. We have different processes of kind of stakeholder analysis for different issues. Knowing, you know, some groups, some stakeholders are inherently going to be involved, and others we need to work a little bit harder to develop that relationship, to build that trust, to kind of reach out to them. So, you know, we have a few different tools that are really thinking about that. With each issue, we'll have its own, but then overall, I mean, I think part of the big advantage, you know, I've written on the importance of, you know, local communities developing their own centers like these, right? We don't like to helicopter into other communities. We really like to do things in Northern Colorado. Because then we can have that long-term relationship, so we can start mapping out. I've written lately about kind of looking at the community as a deliberative system. So then our center is intervening in that deliberative system to try to increase the capacity. For example, you know, probably one of our biggest successes that I've worked on is that the result of a process was actually creating a new community organization, right? This Partnership for Age-Friendly Communities that is such a great bridging institution in our community. So really, how do you connect with existing organizations? How do you help potentially, you know, be a catalyst for creating new organizations? And overall, how do we build the capacity of this deliberative system for us in Northern Colorado to work better, to deal with our shared problems? I can pop in a resource. I know we had a grad student a while back that really did a lot of thinking about, you know, external inclusion and internal exclusion, and kind of build those partnerships. Actually, a couple of them. Katie could probably jump into, because I know, you know, the lot of stuff that she talked about in terms of the community guides is a big part of how we do this work.
Yeah, just to really quickly add on that, you know, we do a lot of our work with the city of Fort Collins, and they have funding. And then one of our goals is often to figure out like how we redistribute that funding in ways that make sense for our community. So like we're paying community guides to develop skills, to host conversations. Those are often like small nonprofit organizational leaders who we are basically paying to train in civic skills. So we kind of use those opportunities to build a wider network beyond the traditional partner. So we usually start with a fairly traditional partner, but then use their funding, resources, and networks to connect with the wider folks in the community who might not have the funding for it, but who really need to be involved in the projects.
And the only thing I would add is we approach partnerships depending on what we want out of the partnership. So we approach it differently. So for instance, we reached out to local libraries because their staff were very interested in hosting events and having community conversations. And so that partnership is aimed at training them in facilitation techniques so that they could do it on their own, or that they could actually also accompany our students when we do ours. The same with the YWCA, where there was just a natural predisposition for people wanting to do the kind of work that we were doing. And so we would sort of pitch them on our work. We would offer them free training, and then we would advise them on how to go about creating their own forum if we were not doing it ourselves. And then the topics that we choose often lead us to introducing ourselves to interested groups who have some sort of connection to the topic. So when we did a series on affordable housing, there was the Council for the Homeless. There were, the Building Association, which, consists of, is primarily an interest group and a lobbying group, but they represent builders. So we would reach out to them and say, hey, we're doing a couple of forums on this particular issue. Would like you to let your people in your organization know about it so you could advertise it, so we could actually get people to the forum. But then afterwards, we would share what we found in terms of our reports so that they would benefit from sort of that snapshot of public opinion. So, just to answer your question, Ryan, it kind of depends, and it's hard. But what we found is that good, solid partnerships, which are nurtured, will help sustain centers like ours because we don't have incredible funding. We don't have, we're a small campus, or 4,000 students, so we're only training a certain number every year. So I think it's really important for the sustainability of programs to have these partnerships.
Van?
I take it that wickedness, the degree of wickedness, is related to the degree of incommensurability of positions and the degree of difficulty in negotiating those. I wondered if you find in your experience if some participants are kind of repelled by the idea of entering a scene of wicked problem, and if others are sort of ready to kind of gird their loins and get to work, and maybe more than just that language concern, are there problems that could seem to a kind of generalized public accounting for what the issue involves seem not wicked, but that individuals may find wicked based on their own and maybe selective others' approach to the issue or experience with the issue?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick, and others can kind of jump in here, but we certainly kind of, I find the Wicked Problems framework and mindset very useful, but it's not it doesn't fix all problems. It doesn't work with everything. Yeah. So I think you can think about kind of various levels of wickedness. Generally we've had a lot of success, haven't had too many people kind of push back directly, right? Partly because people with very strong kind of perspectives, they kind of like the fact that we're not demonizing them, right? That shift from the assumption of wicked people to wicked problems kind of gets in space. That being said, I know, and I can pop this into the resource. I have one slide that I use that I've been playing with for a long time, of looking at deliberative ripeness, like what issues are ripe for deliberation in that frame, and which ones are not, and those that are dominated by activist voices that are framing things, in particular ways, they will push back on that, right? Because they see the strategic value of a different kind of framing. And in some issues, it should be a strategic framing, right? It should be a more an activist kind of frame is going to help us move forward. So yeah, I think we've kind of thought about those in lots of different ways. Hopefully that gets at your question a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a good place to pause for our lunch.